Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. While financial literacy gets plenty of attention, economic literacy doesn't. And there's a big difference between the two. Joining me to discuss is David Bahsen. He's the Chief Investment Officer with the Bahnsen Group and author of There's No Free Lunch. David, it's great to see you. As always, welcome back to Trade Talks.
Thanks so much for having me.
And in your book, There's No Free Lunch, you stress the importance of economic literacy. How can a better understanding help to solve today's challenges?
Well, I'm of the belief that the great challenge we have and have had since the great financial crisis is a lack of economic growth. And I don't believe that people understand the burden of output, the burden of productivity. And this can be a pretty boring talk. People are not going to get very animated talking about words like output or GDP. But when we talk from an economic understanding about why growth is so important to meeting the needs of humanity, and when the idea of growth understood historically and what the need is going forward is kind of put into human terms, I think it all of a sudden really can animate, motivate, and inform public policy.
And so how would you apply the principles of a market economy to the key issues of the day when you think about taxes and wages and trade, but to do it without a political lens, but something more principled?
Yes, well, I think that it starts with understanding what the basic economic principles are. I start with one of the foundational truths that humans act. We start with our understanding of the human person. It was made with reason, made with rational faculties that are different than the rest of the animal kingdom. And mankind really doesn't need incentives to consume. We know what we like, we have taste and appetites, and we're really pretty well conditioned to want to meet those appetites. What we need incentives for is production. And so I think these become less political concepts and more social and human concepts when they're phrased and understood that way.
And David, when you think about our economic forefathers, from the classics to our 20th century freedom lovers to contemporaries that we have today, is there wisdom and insight applicable to today's economy?
Well, I think the great insights of the classical economists that people today, whether Keynesians or supply siders, so really center left and center right, can agree that the classical economists from Adam Smith, David Ricardo, that they introduced ideas about law of supply and demand and law of marginal utility that today we take for granted. But I think we need to get back to understanding how that should inform the way we think about prices. The way we think when we have an inflation problem right now, where is an inadequate production of goods feeding that? Why we don't necessarily want to celebrate a declining labor force, that we want more productivity and output coming. I think that these are the current challenges we have, and a lot of the solutions were found in the literature of classical economists 250 years ago.
It seems like the work in your book, it's less celebrating the enterprise, but really focusing more on the human element of it.
Yeah, the term we use a lot is anthropology, that having a sort of understanding of the human person. And myself being a faith-oriented person, there's a real spiritual component to that too. But fundamentally, everybody has a belief about the human person. And I would like to think that all people, even those who don't have my faith, see the human person as having dignity. And this is where economics should never strip out the dignity of mankind while it goes into different math or science lanes. The social science of economics has to be firmly rooted in the dignity of mankind so that we build an economic framework that honors their productive and creative capacity. That comes down to what I think is, yes, this sort of anthropological understanding of the human being.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, because especially when it's financial media and we're debating the merits of whether we're in a recession or not, and if we get higher unemployment and there's less spending, that will bring inflation back down and we will have achieved, the Fed's targets and so forth. But at the end of the day, and I believe the old expression is, it's a recession if your neighbor lost their job. It's a depression if you lose your job. There are people involved. And when you hear, there's hiring freezes, or we overhired, or we're cutting, 25% of our workforce, that might look good through the lens of earnings or the Fed achieving, its inflation targets, but there's people involved.
That's right. And what I want to do is remember there's people involved on both sides of this. And so in that particular case, someone who loses their job, that's where our sympathy naturally goes to and ought to go to. But then when we talk about economics, we have an employer who has to make difficult decisions too, just like we have an employee who might be suffering from some of those decisions. And it's all weighted in the context of self-interest. We want to encourage an enlightened self-interest that takes into account virtue and character. This is where I argue that some of our views of social organization are deeply economic, because economic has to do with the individual, mankind operating in his self-interest, first to stay alive, to make their basic necessities, but then to provide for their family, and then to try to thrive and have an even better quality of life. It's in the story of civilization, and it's a beautiful story. But mankind is also a social being. And where I think the Marxists clearly went wrong by defining mankind totally in the context of their social capacity, I want to hold very firm to the individual nature of man, and yet acknowledge that mankind functions in community with neighbor. And there is no reason for markets to be separated from a sort of character-filled environment and looking out for one's neighbor. And we can do this without interventions in the marketplace that can be quite distortive.
Yeah, it's such a great ethical conversation to have, especially when you think about the greater good. David, great to catch up with you as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.